The New York Penny Press, 1830 to 1860. The beginning of the 1800s was a time of prosperity. Andrew Jackson became president in 1827. Cities were expanding and the country was well free of the yoke of the British Empire. Newspapers in the early part of the century were mainly accessible by the upper echelons of society. Papers cost 6 cents and could be purchased through subscription. Although the city of New York was expanding, there were some economic scares which impacted many city dwellers. The fluctuation in economics led to high costs of goods and lower incomes. The average pay of a New Yorker was less than 85 cents a day. Benjamin Day, a 23-year-old, had a job print shop on the brink of collapse in the latter half of 1833. Desperate to keep his business afloat, Day decided to print an inexpensive paper to promote his business. Day and some of his print buddies had discussed such a venture a few years earlier when he worked at the Journal of Commerce. Day's goal was not to establish a paper, but to promote and salvage his print business, and if he made a little extra money, that was a bonus. So on September 3rd, 1833, Day created the first penny paper called The Sun. The first edition of The Sun was issued later than other papers. Day stole the stories from the other papers and created bogus ads to make his paper appear successful. Unlike the 6-cent papers, The Sun was printed on 9 by 12-inch sheets, approximately the size of a letter, whereas the expensive counterparts were not printed on 2-foot by 3-foot pages referred to as blanket sheets. Day's paper was more portable and sold for a penny. Day, in the first edition, stated, "The purpose of this paper is to lay before the public, at a price within the means of everyone, all the news of the day, and at the same time afford an advantageous medium of advertising." The paper was a success. On the second day of production, he included an ad. "To the unemployed, a number of steady men can find employment by vending this paper. A liberal discount is allowed to those who buy to sell." Day saw the limitations of other more expensive papers. They worked on a credit system. Ads and subscriptions were given out and then money was collected. The Sun worked on a cash-based system. Advertisements and papers were paid for first. No subscriptions were needed. The paper could be bought on the street. Day offered newspaper boys 100 papers at the reduced cost of 67 cents. This meant that papers were accessible to everyone. People walking down the street could buy a paper or choose not to. With the growing success of his paper, Day hired a writer. He knew his own limitations, and writing was not his forte. He could not rely on the news of other papers. George W. Wisner also was hired as a writer and later became editor and co-owner. Wisner would rise early and go to police stations and courts to collect news. He would then return and write the stories before they were printed. This reporting of current news led to the need for reporters, individuals to go out into the community, collect information about events that occurred. Bennett's Herald also used reporters to gather news. In 1842, New York hosted one of the grandest events of the city, the Bossy Ball, in honor of Charles Dickens' visit. The Herald provided a description for their readership. It was an invitation to thousands of readers to experience the scene vicariously. The reporter borrowed Dickens's style in creating a description of the event. Newspapers of the time relied on old news. These papers did not share current, up-to-date news we expect to find in newspapers today. Instead, news was between 2 to 3 days old for local events and at least a week old if it came from outside the city. Now, considering that it is 1830, it is understandable that some news would not be shared within 24 hours. News could only be sent by train, Pony Express, or carrier pigeon. Time was needed for the news to travel. Day with his penny press, however, needed to keep news as current as possible. He needed people to see news as new daily. What happened yesterday or the day before was old, and that there were more current, more interesting events occurring now. In order to do this, he promoted local news, events and issues that directly affected his readership. This influx in current local news increased sales of his paper and changed what was written in the papers. Sensationalizing stories also increased sales. Stories of local crimes and crises were often popular and piqued the reader's interest. With the growing success of the penny press, Wisner and Day ran into another problem. Day's printing press was a slow hand press, not much different from the Gutenberg press created 400 years earlier. As the popularity of the Sun grew, demands could not be met. The introduction and use of a steam-powered printing press, as well as developments of rolls of paper, increased speed and number of copies produced daily. The Sun was not the only penny paper developed in the 1830s. A total of 35 penny papers started in New York in the 30s, but only 2 survived the decade: Day's New York Sun and Bennett's New York Herald. These 2 papers had a long-standing rivalry. They constantly attempted to surpass the other in their sensationalized news. In 1841, Horace Greeley started the New York Tribune, which added another competitor for Day and Bennett. But what is it about the penny press that created success? There were other papers at the time and other earlier attempts to create an inexpensive paper for the masses. In 1769, Benjamin Franklin's nephew, Benjamin Macomb, created the tri-weekly Penny Post in Philadelphia, but it could not sustain itself. In London, England, there were attempts to create penny papers, but all were shut down by the government unless they contained useful knowledge. Papers which told histories, explained current technologies, explored ancient or foreign cultures, or general interest items. Anything political or radical was not allowed. So why did it work in 1833 New York? There are a few factors which made the penny press successful. First, urbanization. Cities were expanding at enormous rates between the presidency of Andrew Jackson and the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. By 1850, over 40 cities had populations greater than 5,000. New York City went from 200,000 to 1 million between 1830 and 1860. This influx of people led to greater readership. Those entering were looking for work and needed to understand the community they were entering. The penny press addressed both these items. They offered current, up-to-date news on local issues and also advertised employment opportunities. The more expensive papers did not offer these features. Yes, they had local news, but it was limited and tended to be days old. Also, the established papers said ads for laborers and medicine patents and other short-term ads were unrespectable. They did not appear in the more expensive papers. Due to the shift in readership and the concept of a current daily paper, newspaper content changed as well with the advent of the penny press. As mentioned earlier, the penny press had ads to address labor and short-term ads to address public needs. This downplay in repeated advertising and the use of single-day inserts were cheaper and limited ongoing patronage. This allowed the penny press to be independent in their opinions, shifting newspapers from craft to an industry. In addition to this marketing structure, the penny press was more conversational, gossipy, and had a humorous tone. Crime and crisis were staples within the paper. These sensationalized stories offered juicy bits of information and the readers were drawn in. An example is the New York Sun's Moon Hoax, a series of articles written by Richard Adam Locke for the Sun outlining an astronomer's discovery of rivers, blue goats, and hybrid batmen seen through a telescope on the moon. This collection of stories fascinated the public and increased sales. Bennett's New York Herald even commented on the genius of the article. The town has been a gap 2 to 3 days at the very ingenious astronomical hoax. Mr. Locke deserves great credit for his ingenuity, his learning, and his irresistible drollery. The final piece to assist in the success of the penny press was technological advancements. As noted earlier, Day started his paper with a simple hand press. This does not mean that other models of printer were not available. In fact, the original method of printing used by the penny papers were technologically retrogressive, but it was what the printer had at the time that the papers came into existence. However, as circulation of the paper increased, the demand and need for faster printers increased as well. It was not long before the old hand press was replaced with a steam printing press. By the 1840s, the New York Sun was using the Hoe printing press, which could print 1,100 pages an hour, which allowed the paper to accommodate the growing need of its readership. This is a key component. Although the technology was developed earlier, the need for more efficient and greater volume producing machines did not arise until the demand for the paper increased. Steam-operated printing presses were not the only technological advancement to assist in the rise of the penny press. Day's greatest accomplishment was to create fresh news daily. He promoted the idea that yesterday was old. In order for news to be current, it must be timely. Transportation and communication advancements allowed for news to be gathered quickly and cover great distances in a short period of time. The development of the telegraph in the 1840s meant news could travel over the wire instantaneously. This connected cities, allowing for major news items to be shared daily. The penny press was still reliant on steamships, express trains, the Pony Express, and stagecoaches to provide news from unconnected areas. But ultimately, this technological advancement created ease for sharing information. Within a 30-year time span, the face of the newspapers changed dramatically. News was no longer seen as infinite, but finite. Each day changes occurred that the newspaper saw as their responsibility to report. There was an increase in readership due to not only lower cost of papers, but also to the increase in an educated population. Although much of the news was sensationalized and related to local affairs, people gained an understanding of the world around them. The penny press paved the way for new forms of news. It expanded the topics of interest beyond politics to include local affairs, the stock market, sports stories, and other human interest stories. This shift in reporting is still with us today. Although papers have grown in size, thickness, and cost, we still expect current, up-to-date news that can change daily.